Armand here with a quick little catch up on the summer solstice 2023. And if you don't like the catch up, well, then you can have mustard. I used to like the Marx. I still like the Marx Brothers. If you watch their movies now, though, they go ponderously, slowly. The big periods of emptiness and silence in them and things like that. And they were known for being so quick-witted and zany. And it's just interesting to think over the course of the last now 90 years how our nervous systems have changed. Even go back to the 70s and look at movies and see how slowly they move, how slowly the scenes change compared to the way they do now, the camera angles and so on. It's pretty interesting. But that's not what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about the solstice. Now, the solstice, I call it the summer solstice because if you're in the northern hemisphere, it is the summer solstice. If you're in the southern hemisphere, northern hemisphere, it's the summer solstice. In the southern hemisphere, it would be the winter solstice, which means that the light will start growing after the solstice and the days will be getting longer. If you're in the northern hemisphere, it's the beginning of summer, which is great. The other side of the coin is that the days start to diminish a little bit in their length. They don't change very much around the solstice themselves, though. You only change, far less than a minute a day. Depends upon your latitude and so on. Around the equinoxes, you get fast changes. So we look at the solstice as an indication for the next 3 to 6 months. And it's mostly on the level of what's going on in the world. Okay, so there's not a lot to do. You might just acknowledge the solstice when it comes up. It's at 10:57 a.m. Eastern time. That would be 7:57 a.m. Pacific time. Everybody in between, figure it out. That would be 3:57 p.m. if you're in Ireland, or over in England, say, for example, at Stonehenge or Avebury, which is where I was last year. That's a year ago already. And then if it would be an hour after that if you're in Central European time, and everybody else can just do the math. Okay, it may be good to acknowledge that there we are, we're crossing the line. There's not a lot to do. There's not a lot to do at this point. It is good to recognize the height of the cycle, right? That the solar cycle has reached its peak. And that is something that you might reflect on, and the changes that are happening even at that level was worthwhile to think about. Like when you reach a peak, there's no place to go but down, but when you reach the bottom of the trough, there's no place to go but up. And maybe that's a little meditation for you, or maybe to think about the solar power, whether it's renewing itself or it's showing itself at its peak. Either way, this is the energy, vitality of life. You feel it. Maybe that's a way to approach the solstice on a kind of a personal level. Mostly we look at the solstice in terms of what we call in astrology mundane things. Now, mundane sounds like it just means boring. It's not boring. It's stuff to do with the world, mundo, world, mundane. So it's collective stuff. And that's where we usually see the most of solstice and equinox resonance happening. Now, on a personal level, one of the things that is worth noting is that this week, the week of the solstice, Venus has entered the shadow of her retrograde, and she won't retrograde until 22nd of July. Separate video as we get closer to that. But she'll retrograde to September 3rd, and she won't get out of her shadow again until October 6th, more or less. Which means that on a personal level, we're sort of baking this Venus retrograde into the solstice. That's what's happening for us. Venus is slowing down to retrograde, and then she's going to retrograde, and then she's going to go forward again, and she's going to pick up speed and eventually get out of town. So if we think about it that way, the next 3 months, we'll have this sort of Venus retrograde flavor, which, it could be slow for romance and socializing in general. It could put a little bit of a drag on new creative projects. and it's not a great time to get things assessed or appraised. It'll be interesting to see what happens with the markets, but I think particularly things like housing prices and so on. Again, we'll talk about that more when we get closer to the retrograde. We're trying to concentrate on the solstice here, although without any major aspects to the sun immediate. I think that what we have to do is look and see where in the world these things are landing. In other words, where is the sun rising or culminating or setting or directly below? And that often gives us an indication of where in the next 3 to 6 months we'll see a lot of activity. Now, it's really hard to do this because after all, the world is a big place and a lot of stuff happens all the time. And I think, these things tend to get lost. We make the comment that this is where stuff is likely to happen, and very often it does. But then again, things happen so many other places as well. These are places to keep your eye on, however. Now, let's look at where this is. Okay, here's a map. Here is a map of the world, you know that, and we have different points on it. We have the only line I put in is the sun line, and so you can see the sun line cuts through the Aleutian Islands, comes down through the Pacific, hits the tip of Antarctica, goes way below South America, and then it comes up. Now this line gets interesting. This is the line of where the sun is setting. It gets real interesting because there it goes right up the east coast of Africa, touching really South Africa, goes into Mozambique, then up through Somalia, and it cuts across the Arabian Peninsula and goes through southern Iran, and then makes its way up through Russia and then out east. That sort of suggests to me that the east coast of Africa is the area that would probably get our attention mostly. Afghanistan is also in there, and we often hear things from them. Then we have the line of where the sun is at the midheaven, and this one goes straight through Greenland. It comes down through the North Atlantic Ocean, and then it lands in Brazil, and it goes right through the eastern part of Brazil, kind of like lopping off a big chunk. It goes very near Sao Paulo, which is the largest city in I believe it's the largest city in Brazil, and it goes fairly close to the capital of Brazil. Now, I have to say that since the Capricorn solstice back in December of 2022, Brazil has been getting an awful lot of attention. It's been getting a lot of celestial attention at any rate. A lot of stuff seems to be happening there. As a matter of fact, this is the only celestial event that I've looked at for the last 6 months or so that doesn't have a line going through Beijing. Now, I'm only looking at sun lines here, I'm not counting other planets and so on. That kind of bakes into the equation too, but it gets a little bit harder to figure out. When we move over to the Pacific, we have the sun on the IC that is below, and that cuts through a section of Russia, and then it goes right through the main island of Japan. It sort of, it's right in there, and then it goes right through central Australia, and it's landing very near Adelaide. So we're likely to see some stuff happening in this area. I mean, we've been seeing quite a bit of stuff happening in this area, and the China questions and the North Korea questions are always hot, and Australia's been very involved in that lately too. So these are the areas that we'll be looking at and saying, what's going to happen in the next 3 to 6 months? To be fair, that is to not to claim credit for things that are absolutely, 3 months, you're going to hear stuff about Australia and Japan for sure anyway. It would be interesting to see what happens this week, the week of the 21st, June 21st, 2023. So those are a few hints about this solstice. It's a good time to look at this in terms of the sun cycle and the vitality and energy that we feel in our lives and relate it to the solar cycle. That's an internal thing. Venus retrograde is starting to come into our awareness and our consciousness, and it'll be here for the next 3 months and beyond. And so we start to think about, it's not really a great time to go over the top with pleasure and enjoyment and things like that. And then on the world stage, we have some places that we're looking at to see if they don't get a little bit of extra attention in the short run. All right, I'll be back with the weekly forecast and eventually something about Venus retrograde. It's going to be great soon.